Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Michelle Doerr. She is the president of Anavah Consulting, and with a background in as a wildlife biologist and experience in ecopsychology, she designs workshops and coaching that foster healing, growth, and a culture of thriving. I'm really interested to learn more about her motivation to start her consultancy, the work she does with her clients, and the ways that speaking has benefited her. So, welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Michelle.
Yeah, I love the title. I'm ready to geek out.
Wonderful. So, from the bit of research I did on you, I saw that you studied biology. So, what was the motivation to study that?
Well, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a tiger biologist. So I started out with biology and then I went over to wildlife management for my master's.
Oh, okay. And what was the motivation to even go on to do a master's?
Well, it was the wildlife management part. For the most part in the field, you have, you have to have a master's. At least back then, I think a few things are loosening up now, but at least back then you had to have a master's degree to get any sort of significant position in the field. So yeah, it was kind of required.
All
But
right.
also, I still went to the heart of I wanted to help animals in some way, do something with animals in some way.
Got it. So now, once you finished your education, what kind of work did you do when you were done with school?
Field was actually between my undergrad and graduate. So my second cousin was the state wildlife biologist in Minnesota. I'm pretty sure he got me this gig, but I was an intern at the fisheries department near my home for a summer. And I realized I enjoy that, but I still was more interested in, the furry kind versus the scaly kind.
Oh, okay, nice. And then once you were done with that type of work, what did you do then?
My first job into the field of wildlife was actually an internship with Minnesota Department of Natural Resources in their Farmland Wildlife Research Unit. So the research unit there did various studies. I was specifically involved again in my first role there with tracking all of the deer vehicle collisions in the state and figuring out where the highest prevalence were. And here's the odd thing, the other part of that, well, I think we all had to do it, but the other part of that was we had to carry what's called a fetus kit in our cars. And if we were driving along the road in May and there was a a deer that had been killed by a vehicle and it was a doe, we had to go cut it open and see if it had, if it was pregnant at all, if it had, a single twins, whatever. And so that's how we tracked the reproductive rates in that part of the state.
Wow. So were you ever
Crazy. Yeah, I had to carry knife and gloves and wet wipes and all that kind of stuff in my car.
Oh man, so you had to cut open deers, huh? That was part of your job. Oh,
It was part of my job.
good grief. Well, at least there's people like you that are willing to do it. So thank you. Thank you for your service.
You weren't ex- you weren't expecting that today, were you?
No, no, I was not expecting to hear about deer cutting today. I can assure you of that. Hopefully, maybe it'll be the last time. So who knows? Life is long. Wonderful. Okay, so then, were you ever, during your time working in this field, were you ever a leader of people?
Uh, you know, when you think of leader as far as like a position of authority,
Yeah.
early in my career, I would not say I was that, but I did most definitely have to lead people. So some of the other work that I did well, my master's was in urban deer management. So that, and the shtick that I use in some of my speaking work, because I work primarily with the conservation community, is 90% of wildlife management is people management, but we didn't get that in school. So even though I was evaluating a deer management program, it was mostly dealing with people. So I had to, and in that urban deer work, I had to learn how to speak to the public. I had to learn, I mean, I had trial by fire. So in my early urban deer work, there was one of the cities had a group that really was opposed to the killing of deer. And by the way, we didn't enjoy doing it, but it had to be done. The population had gotten so large in this city, and they ended up sort of hiring this terrorist sort of person, believe it or not. Long story short, it ended up this person they hired had damaged some of the traps. We ended up in court over that because there was some rules and regulations within the state that prevented that from happening. Like if someone would be prosecuted if something like that happened. Anyway, I ended up having to testify in court that this group that was opposed to it, we had met with them at some point, and they had said that basically the only thing I had to testify was this group had said they would do anything to stop the program from happening. So that was basically my testimony. But I had to go to federal court. I'm just out of school, basically, and I had to go testify in federal court. So that was a little scary.
Wow. Talks of terrorism and
Yeah.
deer cutting. I definitely didn't think I was going to be listening to any of that today, but you know
Who
what?
knew, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
I got started to tell in my speaking business, though.
yeah, for sure. So you had said that people management it was certainly a part of your job, but the idea of taking a job that required the management of people, is that something that you wanted to do and just shied away from, or is it something that just never came up?
I think when we're doing our undergrad and graduate work, and that may have changed because it's been a while since I've been in school, but I just it did just generally kind of didn't come up. But now the situation is very different. People in graduate school now, I think there is a realization that majority of the work is dealing with people, conflict, all that kind of stuff. So we have to be better at dealing with people. But back then, for me, it just didn't come up until it had to, right? Until I was forced into it.
The roles that you ended up taking throughout your work journey, or were those roles that you sought out, or did it just work out that way?
A lot of them kind of worked out that way. When I ended up in the farmland wildlife research unit, I was applying for different internships, and that's where I landed. And then from there, I was trying to, well, actually, for my internship is where I ended up in doing my graduate work. So I wouldn't have done so one of the group leaders there was working with several graduate students and helping to gather up some funding. And so he actually helped fund my graduate project. So that's how I ended up doing the graduate work. So that kind of, happened. It wasn't like a pursuit or anything like that. And then from there, yeah, things just kind of rolled into the next thing. Like then I was doing urban deer management work. From that work, I ended up as the urban wildlife. I ended up doing wildlife damage work for a little while. That was about a year. And then I ended up in the urban wildlife program. And most of that was managing deer and geese in the Twin Cities metro area in Minnesota. And one of the things that I did while I was there was help create this group called, believe it or not, again, probably never going to, the Metro Bow Hunters Resource Base. So it's a hiring a sharpshooter or something like that to kill the deer, have, remove the deer in a city. If it's done during the archery season, they can get a permit from the Department of Natural Resources to kill the deer during the archery season. Now, the thing that I do want to say is there's no waste. The deer go to either a food shelf or something specific. So they are utilized. But from there, my work there, I ended up in the archery industry for 14 years. So who'd have thought?
Wow. Yeah, you've had quite an illustrious career, to say the least. But then eventually you decided to start your consultancy avenue. So what was the motivation to do that?
Well, that kind of goes to my 90% of wildlife management is people management. Even when I left the archery industry, I just felt like leadership was very authoritarian, and it didn't work well for most people. So I was trying to figure out ways to bring a better system of leadership. And then again, this just kind of happened upon me. I found ecopsychology. And that's kind of a blend. Basically, ecopsychology is healing people and healing planet at the same time. And I just fell in love with that. And so I ended up getting a certificate in that. And I'll just say one more thing. How I ended up in understanding psychology and getting more into psychology is actually through my daughter's eating disorder. And we can talk about this because we wrote a book right there. We wrote a book about it, and we speak about that as well. So that's how I ended up getting into psychology, because the psychology that worked for my daughter was not the typical medical model psychology. And I was fascinated with it. And so you can see that my career is just sort of blending things together.
Yeah, 100%. Actually, I am rather interested to hear about the book. What was, I guess, the motive was certainly the motivation to write it, and what do you hope people take away from it?
Our major speech that we give to people is about separating yourself from your struggle. So what happened with my daughter was the system that she was in just kept, they never got to the underlying cause. I just kept saying that, but you're not getting to the underlying cause. You're not getting to the underlying cause. And so I kind of pulled her out of the system, and with my counselor, because I had been going to a counselor separately because eating disorders affect everyone around them. And my counselor had suggested a teaming approach where I spent time with my counselor, she spent time with her counselor, and then we came together to discuss. When I walked in the room, went from my room in my counseling session over to my daughter's to kind of compare, I could see she had shifted. And what happened was her counselor had done this Venn diagram thing where she asked, "Who are you?" And she had been so deep into her eating disorder that she couldn't answer the question. She would say, "Well, I have an eating disorder." "Oh, no, I understand why you're here. Tell me about you." And so then they got into creative, smart, all that kind of stuff. And then she said, "Well, what are the characteristics of the eating disorder?" And, I'm making this long story short, but isolator, manipulator, like all these things like that. And then she asked my daughter, "Well, where do they overlap?" And my daughter, thought it was kind of a trick question, but it wasn't. It was like, it doesn't. You are not your eating disorder. And I think that same system can work for any struggle. You are not your depression. You are not your addiction. You are not your whatever. And so we write about that a little bit in our book. But the other thing with the book that we wanted to do with that was it's written in a way that her stories are written in plain text. My stories are written in italics, so you know immediately who's speaking. But the way we did it was we each wrote significant stories for us during the time. And if the other person was in the story, we wrote a response to that with our own perspective. And there's one chapter in there when our editor was going through, she actually said, like, these don't align. And so we had to remind her, we're not here to change perspective. We're not here to like correct the experience. We're here to show you that this is what happens is part of an eating disorder. And we make it clear in the book that, you know, these are our two perspectives, and we're quite possibly missing some other perspectives, her brother and her dad, to name it two of them. So we're hoping to take that story out to say, you are not your struggle. And then I talk about some parenting stuff on the side, and she talks about her experiences as individual speakers. So we do a little bit of all three of those. We can duo it, and we can take it from each of our perspectives.
So with the work that you're, or the topic that you're speaking of now, Michelle, is that a topic that you speak of with the wildlife community, or is it a different audience?
No, that's a different audience. Yeah. So again, I'm kind of feels like I'm kind of all over the place, but no, that's a different. So we focus that in more of the, you know, eating disorder wellness kind of community specifically. On the wildlife side, my primary speech, actually, I just did one last week, is called Beyond Burnout and Bubble Baths. I am just to be clear, I use the word burnout because I think people understand what that word is. But my speech is, hint, it's not burnout. It's a bunch of other things that are primarily to do with the system and not you as an individual. You have to hold yourself accountable, of course, but I am here to tell you that it's a systems thing. And there's other things going on. For instance, I'll go back to my urban deer stuff. I got into wildlife management to, you know, protect and help animals. So that's here. But I ended up mostly killing them, managing them. And so there's a cognitive dissonance there. And that's not a term that the field is used to, even though it happens all the time. I want to protect, you know, I'm a land manager, but I have to issue wetland drainage permits for construction, right? So those two are missing. So there's it's almost in a way, little bits of our soul get crushed when we have to do those things. So that's just one of the terms that I use, like cognitive dissonance. Could be disillusionment. I mean, how many people actually believe science anymore, right? So you spent, like my master's, you spend years putting together research, and then people are like, well, I don't like that, so I don't believe you, right? So there's that, you know, there's lots of things going into it. So my speech is about the language that is better to use for what's really going on, and then based on that, here's some things that you can do to overcome those.
Your story of people not believing science reminded me of a children's book that I wrote a few years ago. And I sent it to an acquaintance. And he said that the book was cool, but he didn't like it because, or one critique he had of it was that at the end of it, there was no definitive answer. And it reminded me thinking,
Oh,
well, that happens in science all the time. That's actually the point of it, really. It's to do research to get to that answer at some point. But if you don't have an answer right now, that's just what it is right now. But that doesn't mean that won't be the
right.
case later. But I just found it really interesting that he wanted this clear-cut answer. And I thought maybe that the case for that was because it's a children's book, and perhaps as adults, we think that kids appreciate clear-cut answers. But I guess my response to him was, if the goal of being an adult, having children, is to prepare them for adulthood, shouldn't we be preparing them for uncertainty? Like just like what my book had illustrated, because it's certainly something they're going to have to deal with when they get older. It won't be all clear-cut answers when they're adults, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at least the ones I'm familiar with, if you take a look at any scientific study, there's a section on there for further study, right? And there's I mean, you don't see a 100%. There's no such thing. And like you said, most science is breaking down things. We're learning now that we have to take the systems approach and like build more things. But for the most part, science is taking a small piece of a bigger picture and studying it. So again, can't have a definitive answer because we don't have full context. Yeah. And then I think the other thing I'll say too, with regard to science, I love science. And also, we can't forget story. Like, it makes me think of a workshop that we did around inclusion. And the folks that had hired us had this pre and post survey. Now, I didn't get enough time to critique the pre and post survey because it wasn't matching what we were teaching anyway. But at the end, the report came out, but it didn't include the stories of like, there were 3 or 4 major aha moments that didn't show up in there, that don't, and so we have to have both. We have to have the science and we have to have the story, in my opinion.
Man, I agree with you too. Michelle, when I first
Yeah.
started this YouTube channel and podcast, it had to deal with my own struggles giving presentations in front of others when I worked as an engineer. And I was really curious to hear from other people that have STEM backgrounds about their struggles. So I'm curious, speaking in front of others, is that something you've always been good at? And if not, what did you do to get better at it?
Well, lots of things. Interestingly, though, I was fortunate enough to be exposed to speaking in some ways earlier. So I grew up on a farm and I was a part of the 4-H program. And I participated in what they called dairy judging. So they actually put some animals out and you have to pretend you're the judge. How would you rank them? And then you have to give your reasons to a judge. So that was my first thing into speaking, was I had to tell this person how I would have ranked these animals and why. And the other thing with 4-H is we had to do demonstrations in front of the club. So I was introduced to speaking fairly early. I also was an exchange student in high school. And when I came back from my exchange program, a lot of local people wanted to hear my story. So I just slowly had little things that I would put in front of the audience. When I worked for the archery industry, I just speak in front of the board all the time. And what made me, well, this was kind of a forced situation. What forced me to get better at it was my boss would tell me I'd have 30 minutes to cover something. And inevitably I would get to the time where I was up. And then he'd tell me I had 5. So I had to learn what my 5 points were. Like, I had to learn quickly how to summarize things and get to the point. So that was kind of a trial by fire too. So I've been exposed to speaking, a lot of my life. And then I've just learned, like, when you listen to your audience a little bit more, then you learn maybe need to use a different word. Like, for instance, when I worked for the archery industry, and we were trying to put archery into cities, we talked about archery safety. Well, you can't actually guarantee 100% safety. The words that they use are called risk management. So you have to learn how to listen to your audience and use the language that they understand. So I think yeah, I think I've slowly been picking things up as I've gone throughout my career.
For the people who are listening or watching our conversation, Michelle, and they see the benefit of improving at speaking in front of others, what's the first thing that they should focus on?
I would say get clear on your message and get clear on your audience. So have a balance between what I want to say and what they want to hear. And get succinct first and then complement with story and information and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, succinct is definitely something that I focus on a lot, and it's something I wish that others would focus on more.
And it's still a struggle for me because I want to do so much. I always like that's my thing. Like I want to squeeze in so much, and I have to too learn to be like, okay, what's the main thing, one or two things that I want this audience to walk away with.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about it, I'm just thinking about me even going to networking events, and you asking somebody what they do, and they talk for some time. And I just remember sometimes I'll be just looking at their mouth and thinking, wow, it's still moving. And
Guilty. I'm so guilty because I mean, we just talked about kind of my whole career. If you look at my life on paper, it's like, what was going on? Like, it's kind of confusing. And so it is hard to say, and then I do this work with my daughter and then I do my own work, right? So there's more than one thing going on too. So it's not easy to my elevator speech. It's a continuous work in progress.
well, people like me, thank you for continuing to work on it. Well, Michelle, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for being a guest. How can people get in touch with you?
You can get in touch with me on my website. It's ANAVAH consulting.com, AnavahConsulting.com. And my email is Michelle@AnavahConsulting.com. And I would love for anyone to reach out. My primary work is with conservation and environmental organizations, really working on culture and well-being.
Excellent. Well, everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.